Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. The politics is officially back on the menu. Big rumours as to what's going on behind the scenes right now at Ferrari, McLaren and Mercedes. Some of the key names that are leaving some of the top teams and joining other teams, and rumours starting to emerge that Mercedes are not exempt from this either. Yes, they might have the strongest engine next year, but they will also have key names leaving their team in the coming months, some of which might be going to the Scuderia, but as Toto Wolff planted some seeds to try and prevent that from happening. All sorts going on today. Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. It is the Azerbaijan Grand Prix coming up. Just to quickly note, McLaren will win the championship, obviously, but they can win it this weekend. The current standings are McLaren 617 points, Ferrari 280, Mercedes 260. If they outscore their rivals by at least 9 points, they'll win the championship this weekend. Not exactly a guarantee. This, if you guys haven't seen it yet, is kind of remarkable. This was Fernando Alonso's car before the Italian Grand Prix. You guys will know he came out of the Ascari chicane and his front right suspension just collapsed, which was very surprising at the time, and Alonso continues to be one of the unluckiest men in sport. Now, this was caused, remarkably enough, by an incident at the start of the Grand Prix that we'll see in a second. Aston say some gravel hit Fernando's car in the first lap of the race in multiple areas, including his suspension, which compromised it. The team were unaware of the damage sustained. Low-level continuous loading caused the eventual failure of this part. So, as remarkable as it is, the moment where Max Verstappen pushed Lando onto the grass, or Lando drove himself onto the grass, whatever you want to say, this moment here at the start of the Grand Prix, when all of this gravel and, whatever was kicked up onto the track, Fernando basically drove right into all of this, and at the time it doesn't look like much. This was it. This was the whole moment of him getting some gravel, but actually you can see there were some photos taken, and on the close-ups you can see that there were, based on this gravel and moving at high speed, some indents in that front right suspension. You can see on a couple of these images just small marks on those parts, which over the course of several laps got to the point where a failure, while completely unbeknown to the team, was going to happen. So kind of remarkable, but that continues. Now, Aston Martin, they are cooking for next year, or are they not? We know that Ferrari are the kings of gassing up next season, right? It's always about next year. But Aston Martin have also been talking a big game lately. They say the following: Adrian Newey has added a big lift to the approach the team is taking. People are enjoying their work. They are smiling at the results that they are seeing. Now, of course, Formula 1 is very much a relative game, but it does feel like Aston Martin are happy with what they're cooking up. Whether it's going to be good enough compared to rivals, whether the engine's going to be good enough, that is certainly a key factor that we'll get into in the coming minutes. Just to quickly say, I think many of us expected by middle of September that there would be some announcements from Mercedes as to their drivers, right? Because we've known for some time, and Toto Wolff, to be fair, has even said it, that it will be George and Kimi next year at the team. That is not going to change. Max is staying at Red Bull. Everyone knows it. But the terms of those arrangements have not yet been confirmed. Certainly more relevant, you could argue, on the Russell side, because as we well know, Verstappen has been a candidate for that seat and will likely continue to be into the future. Toto Wolff the other day was making some indications that he wasn't particularly keen on giving George Russell a 2-year contract, and with all that being said, George still doesn't have a contract for next year. Now, he's got nowhere else to go. Mercedes have no one else that they would rather have right now anyway. So this is going to happen, but it's just a little bit strange. I think that it's not happened yet, right? I mean, Russell has... I don't think he's been quite the driver of the season. I would give that still to Max, but Russell's certainly not been far off, right? He's been, I think, undeniably a top 3 driver of the season so far, probably top 2 given his results in a Mercedes, which is, he's pretty much maximised it almost all the time. But yet he's not got a contract for next year, and his contract talks are becoming somewhat more complicated. Even Toto Wolff has been commenting on a few things, and we'll see one of the potential things he might be cooking up behind the scenes in a second. He's the boss, but he's also his own boss, right? He gets to choose whether he stays or goes, and he says, I'm enjoying, I want to continue, at least until the team starts winning again. I still see myself as the executive team boss. So pretty interesting from Toto, kind of implying that if Mercedes get back to winning ways next year, he might be like, okay, my job here is done, right? Like, yes, he did inherit a phenomenal team when Mercedes were first a thing following the Brawn days, but it was also an impressive task on his hands to maintain that success during the period that they had it, which is, as always we know, not easy to do. But next year, if they do get back to winning ways, Toto might decide, okay, I've played my part in this team and I want to be a chairman, a CEO, move to the supervisory board in agreement with the other shareholders. So he does talk about he might have to fire himself at some point, but we'll see about that. A few updates on Ferrari just to go through before we discuss all the big rumours behind the scenes. Max has given his thoughts on driving for Ferrari, the fact that he would also want to do it, as would any other driver. We're expecting in a couple of weeks' time him to maybe drive a Ferrari 296 GT3 car around the Nürburgring. Now he's got his Permit A license to race one of those. He did a test in it a while ago, if you guys remember that. He apparently set a track record, but he couldn't race it in a competition until he's now got his license that he achieved last Saturday. So it's all going on, and Max says, look, Ferrari are great, I'd love to be there, but it's got to make sense, right? It's not just going to be because I want to, it's because I actually think it's the most sensible opportunity. Hamilton said a few things on his struggles with the 25 car, and for next year says that during the race weekends at the moment, and even though Hamilton's not had great results recently, I think he's actually been happier with his progress, happier with how he's feeling the car underneath him. But he says, this car requires an alien driving style. I'm getting better and better throughout the weekend. I'm getting faster and faster. I'm unlocking that and gaining confidence, but it's not really there early in the weekend. And by the time that it is there, he's qualified further back than he would like. So he's basically just hoping the next year's cars are more familiar to his own style, which, based on what we understand about them, they quite possibly will be. But there was, of course, talk that this year's Ferrari might suit him better than last year's Mercedes. But it seems to just be a general thing with these ground effect cars that don't really cater to the very late braking, driving the car on the ragged edge style that Hamilton was so successful with in the earlier days of his career. He also, though, mentions when, if ever, he plans to retire. And Fernando will probably give it another season or two, but I can't see Fernando really staying around beyond probably 2026, maybe 2027. But Hamilton says, I've got no plans to stop. I really enjoy that Fernando is still racing. It means he's older than me, as long as I'll keep going as long as he does, even if he's 50. So that's Hamilton's perspective. He's kind of putting the timeline on that to say, okay, when Alonso calls it a day, then I will consider it. Before then, there is no chance, because he doesn't want to be outraced by Alonso, which I can totally understand given their historic rivalry as well. He also gave a few comments on why Mercedes, he had to part ways. He felt like he was a bit too comfortable there. He was a bit too complacent, and he felt like he needed to take this step away into a team that he truly believes in. I believe in the potential, what we can achieve, but no one succeeds without going through tough patches. But we're looking forward to sunnier days, because right now it's not been great for Ferrari and Hamilton. That is pretty undeniable. And Jerome D'Ambrosio, now this is an interesting one as we segue here, because D'Ambrosio used to be a Mercedes guy, as did Loic Serra, both of those individuals now at Ferrari. And as D'Ambrosio says, tyres have been a major issue for Ferrari. Loic Serra is a specialist on that. He doesn't talk much, but hopefully the results will speak. He talks about the next year's car being his first car, Loic Serra's, starting from a revolution in suspension design. The tyres are different. Our task is to balance all of that. And he goes on to say a number of things about how everyone's in good harmony, and it's all the classic stuff from Ferrari. There's talk about some concern about the Mercedes power unit next year. D'Ambrosio says there's multiple factors, teams exploiting some grey areas, but believing the rules aren't going to allow so many extreme loopholes that we have seen before, and optimism that when they get to Melbourne they'll have a particularly competitive package, and McLaren, how competitive they might be next year as well. So some thoughts from D'Ambrosio, but generally, as always with Ferrari, some optimism that they will turn things around, discussing the correlation that has improved in recent rounds. But speaking of that idea of fewer loopholes, the FIA have had quite a few interesting things to say on this. One thing is about the pace of the cars, because we are expecting there to be substantial performance differentials next year between the respective machines, and even Tombazis from the FIA has said that not all teams will be ready for 2026. The other thing that he said is about rule exploitation. So the rules are out, the teams can have a look at them for a long time now, Adrian Newey, among others, I'm sure will have come up with some very interesting ideas. But the FIA, you know how it goes, the spirit of the regulations, right? Are we going to allow something like when Aston Martin had that interesting rear wing they came up with, that like circular looking thing? I thought I'd find up an image of it if you guys didn't remember it, but you weren't allowed to use these like flat lines on the side, right? Because that would create too much dirty air for the car behind and was against the spirit of the regulations. So Aston Martin came up with this way of creating that same kind of idea, but doing it with this like curved section so that technically it was allowed. But I think relatively swiftly after this, I think they introduced it for Hungary back in 2022, but eventually they were told, all right, you can't really be getting away with that anymore. The point is that teams will find loopholes in these regulations, but what Tombasis says is that if you exploit them, it will be suicide for you because we will shut you down. Pretty much what he mentions, which is kind of an interesting point, is that if there are potential grey areas, he wants the teams to ask for clarification on those grey areas. Because if there's some sort of a loophole that the teams are finding, we've adopted a different approach compared to situations in the past. If a team came up with a solution based on a certain interpretation of the rules without asking us for clarification, we would never listen to them. If someone developed a concept based on a 50-50 ambiguous interpretation, it would be suicide. So basically what he says is, if it's evident in the rules that you can do what you want to do, then okay. But if it requires an ambiguous reading, if you have to read a sentence that says you can only do X with Y, and it's like, well, maybe if we read it that way, it's okay. The FIA are saying we won't allow that. Now, of course, they are going to say this, right? And if I'm a team and I'm reading something and I say, I reckon I could argue that that's fine, then what are the FIA going to do, right? Like, what repercussions do they really have here? This might be a threat from the FIA without really the ability to police it. But they do suggest that if you go to them and say, okay, hey, we're thinking about this, but the rule is a bit ambiguous, what do you think? Can we do it or not? Now, if that happens, they confirm that they will issue an identical communication to all teams. So if there is a question asked about a grey area with little clarity, then we will communicate that to every team. So every team then knows, okay, someone is looking at this area of the regulations and they are thinking about doing something like this. So that's the issue, right? If you're a team and you think you've got a loophole, unless you're fully confident that you can argue that it's okay, then you're going to have to go to the FIA and say, all right, can we do this? And if they say yes, but, then they're probably going to email all the teams and say this is what we just agreed, which maybe still gives that team in question a head start, but also means that it's probably not a loophole that nobody else will be exploiting. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other big piece of the puzzle today is on the performance differential of the cars, and that's going to be relevant to this Mercedes-Ferrari drama here in a second. Now, Mario Isola, he is designing, with Pirelli, of course, he's the top guy there, the tyres for next year. A few interesting things here said, and I'll just kind of scroll through the most important thing in the article. So there's quite a lot going on here, but the main thing is that the current tyres, the expected performance differential on a lap-by-lap basis between the tyres is meant to be half a second a lap. The C1 is meant to be half a second a lap faster than the C2, but less durable, etc., through the range. Now, next year, because the cars are going to be more different in performance from front to back, which is at this point inevitable anyway when you reset the rule cycle, but especially given the complexity involved for 2026, that number, instead of being half a second, is actually going to be 3/4 of a second, 7 or 8 tenths. So between the C1 and the C6, that gap now expands quite substantially by a couple of seconds, right, over that range, really, when you consider the extra margin that they are looking to introduce. The other key thing that was mentioned further on is he was asked the question, the simulations for 2026, what differences did you find between the best teams and the less advanced teams? And this is important because Pirelli need to make tyres that will work at certain levels of downforce and under certain loads. in an ideal world, they would have one car that they could design the tyres for and would be perfect for that amount of downforce and that amount of load. But it's going to differ substantially. He says the gap between the best teams in terms of downforce and the worst teams can be 20%. It's a very large figure, and to be on the right side, we take into account most severe simulations, but it's important for us not to underestimate the numbers that we are given, because the teams are doing their own simulations and they're giving the data from those simulations to Pirelli, because Pirelli need the data to design their tyres. And Pirelli are seeing substantial differentials between the best and the worst. So I guess the question becomes, what does a 20% downforce reduction look like? Does it align with some of the numbers that we heard from the FIA with about a 4 seconds difference potentially in lap time? So look, I asked ChatGPT what he thought about it, and it did some really, quick and dirty maths here, but effectively it came up with a similar answer, right? Like, if you reduce downforce by 20% over an 80 seconds lap, you're probably expecting 3.5 to 4.5 seconds slower in lap time. And to some degree, you might expect to gain a bit back on that on the straights. If your car has less downforce, then it's probably going to have, at least to some extent, less drag. It's not going to make as much difference, but, potentially the gap could be between 3 and 4 seconds. And that does align pretty well with what we've seen other estimates be given as well, right? There was a big talk a while ago from the FIA that the gap between the top and the worst teams next year is going to be about 4 seconds per lap. And based on the data here from Mario Isola, that is what we're looking at, right? Like, next year, the worst cars will be miles off the pace. So, yeah, as I've said a couple of times, enjoy these close qualifying sessions while it lasts. We're probably going to be back to a world next year where P4 is a second off P1, but, we will see. It doesn't mean the season's not going to be entertaining. Now, the other big component here for next year are these big rumours around Ferrari. So if you guys are unfamiliar, over the last few days, there was lots of talk last week that Wolf Zimmermann and Lars Schmidt, two key individuals of the Ferrari engine project, are leaving, and they've been poached by Mattia Binotto, who used to be at Ferrari, but of course is now at Audi. Now, the Racing News 365 guys talked to some of their sources on this and came up with some pretty interesting reactions. They understand the work of Zimmermann and Schmidt in the conceptual design of the power unit was actually completed several months ago, with the head of power unit, Enrico Gualtieri, already scheduling tests on the dyno for the new engine and transmissions. It's been reported the 2026 power unit has been optimized, so the point is that it might not be the end of the world that these guys are leaving. In close synergy with the aero department, reinforced by the arrival of Frank Sanchez, it is believed the internal fluid dynamics of the 2026 Ferrari will be particularly innovative, based on a strong boost from the power unit's packaging. This will be a vital factor given the other things. Now, this is very relevant. The current feeling is that Mercedes have the strongest engine, right? This is a particularly strong paddock rumour that Mercedes is set to enjoy a significant advantage, and Mercedes themselves have certainly not played this down. They've said, oh well, we'll see where we are next year. We're hitting targets, but I'm sure other teams are hitting their targets as well and all this. But it's not like Mercedes have totally denied it. Now, what's particularly interesting is that Mercedes has apparently denied that 2 of its engineers have moved from Brixworth's high-performance powertrains over to Ferrari. So Mercedes says, don't know what you guys are talking about, we're not losing anyone to the Scuderia, but apparently this publication's sources have indicated that maybe it's not Ferrari, but certainly some engineers are leaving Mercedes. So in the same way that Ferrari maybe have already cooked up their power unit, and now the top couple of guys are leaving, Mercedes may have done the same. They may have cooked up their power unit and now some of their guys are gone. Now, Ferrari would like to take those guys, but Mercedes, having been considered the dominant force, are an attractive team to join in that sense, but also the opposite could be true for Ferrari. The big implication of this article is that this rumour was strategically circulated, that Ferrari was well behind its rivals, meaning that engineers of interest to the Scuderia would not be so tempted to move if the rumour is that Ferrari aren't going to be all that, so, don't join because you won't get the bonus at the end of the year, etc, etc. But apparently this is all part of the politics game being played, one that has been unfolding for at least a year between the top teams. It is understood that more surprises with significant technical transfers, not only relating to the power unit, but also with aerodynamic and vehicle dynamics stuff, potentially involving the top 3 teams. So presumably McLaren as well, with Mercedes and Ferrari in addition. So this I thought was very interesting. The idea of this rumour that Mercedes are well ahead of the curve being strategically circulated by Mercedes to try to disincentivize their own engineers leaving for Ferrari is a very interesting concept. Now, was this circulated by Toto himself? Break Boosted here comes out and says that Todger Wolff maybe has spread this false information, but it actually could be a good thing for Ferrari, right? Because the key rumour is Mercedes are the best power unit, everyone else is lagging behind. But if that rumour has to some extent come from Mercedes because they don't want to lose their top guys to their chief rival, then maybe there's a world where really Ferrari aren't that far behind, or actually it's very close at the top, and this was simply a strategic play on behalf of Toto Wolff. So look, the politics game is always being played, and this was an interesting insight into how that might be getting played with regard to next year's power units. But the reality is still there that Mercedes, in addition to Ferrari, but Mercedes too are probably losing some top staff, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that 4-second gap that we mentioned is going to be between the next top teams next season, right? That may be true between the best team next year and Cadillac or whoever's worse, but it may not be true that the gap at the front is necessarily all that much greater. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Just one final thing with Baku on the horizon. Red Bull versus Ferrari in Baku. 0 poles for Red Bull, but 4 Grand Prix wins. Ferrari, 5 poles for them, 0 wins as yet. Maybe this weekend is the one. But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.